It was a brisk evening, and Jamal Carter's breath puffed in the chilly air as he walked down the familiar, cracked sidewalks of his neighborhood. He had just finished a long shift at the local grocery store, his mind racing with thoughts of his future schoolwork, the mounting pressure of college applications, and the terrifying prospect of how he would ever afford tuition. His dreams of making it out of his working-class neighborhood seemed to stretch further out of reach with each passing day. Jamal had just reached the bus stop when his eyes caught sight of something unusual, a sleek black luxury car idling near the curb. He wouldn't have thought much of it if it weren't for the man stumbling out of the driver's seat, clutching his chest, his face contorted in pain. Jamal's instincts kicked in. Without hesitation, he sprinted toward the man. "Sir. Are you okay?" Jamal's voice cracked with urgency as he reached the stranger's side. The man groaned, his hand pressing hard against his chest, and then, with a violent spasm, collapsed onto the cold concrete. Jamal dropped to his knees beside him, fumbling in his pocket for his phone. His hands shook as he dialed 911, his voice rising in panic as he told the operator, "There's a man having a heart attack. Please hurry." The operator guided him through the basics of CPR. Jamal pressed down on the man's chest, his heart racing, his mind desperately willing this stranger to survive. The minutes stretched endlessly. Onlookers had gathered, but none moved to help. Jamal could feel their eyes on him, suspicion lurking behind their stares, and he knew why. In this affluent area, a black teenager kneeling over the body of an older white man didn't look like a rescue mission to them, it looked like trouble. He could hear faint whispers from the crowd. No one said it aloud, but Jamal knew what they were thinking. They were waiting for him to make a wrong move. By the time the ambulance arrived, Jamal's arms were shaking from the effort. The paramedics jumped out, rushing over to take control. Jamal stepped back, his breath heavy, his hands trembling as he watched them work. Moments later, 2 police officers arrived, their hands already resting on their belts. Jamal's pulse quickened. He stood still as they approached, eyes narrowing as they took in the scene. "What's going on here?" one of the officers asked. His voice clipped, his eyes flicking from Jamal to the paramedics working on the man. I was helping him," Jamal stammered. "He was having a heart attack. I did CPR until they got here." The officer's eyes lingered on Jamal for a beat too long. The other officer asked, "What's your name?" "Jamal." "Jamal Carter," he answered, his voice steady, but inside he was boiling with frustration. He had just saved a man's life, but here he was, being treated like a suspect. "Where were you before this?" the officer pressed, suspicion lacing his tone. "I was coming home from work," Jamal replied, holding back the urge to snap. He glanced at the paramedics, who were loading the unconscious man onto the stretcher, hoping someone might vouch for him. Instead, one of the bystanders piped up. He was the only one who helped, a small nod of approval, but it didn't erase the tension. The officers eventually let Jamal go, but the experience left him feeling bitter. Even when you're a hero, being black meant you were always under suspicion. Jamal watched as the ambulance sped away, the sirens fading into the distance. He didn't even know the man's name. All he knew was that his life had just intersected with someone from a world so different from his own, a world that, despite his actions, still looked at him with doubt. The next morning, Jamal was still shaken from the night before. He told his mother and sister about what had happened, recounting how he had saved a man's life. His sister Tasha looked at him with wide eyes. "You're like a real-life superhero," she exclaimed, her voice full of awe. Jamal smiled but waved it off. "I just did what anyone would have done." Later that day, as he was leaving school, a sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb, its tinted windows making it impossible to see who was inside. Jamal's stomach dropped. Was it the police again? His heart raced, and he began to walk faster. But the passenger window rolled down, revealing a man in a sharp suit. "Jamal Carter?" the man asked, his tone brisk and businesslike. Jamal stopped in his tracks, nodding cautiously. "Yeah, who's asking?" The man gestured toward the back seat. "I'm Mr. Harrison, Mr. Jonathan Coleman's lawyer. Mr. Coleman would like to see you." Jamal's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Wait, Mr. Coleman?" The guy from last night? He's okay. Harrison nodded curtly. Alive, thanks to you. Now Mr. Coleman would like to meet with you. Still bewildered, Jamal slid into the back seat, the leather interior far more comfortable than anything he was used to. The drive to Coleman's estate felt surreal. As they crossed into the wealthier part of town, Jamal couldn't help but notice the towering mansions and perfectly manicured lawns. It was a far cry from his neighborhood, where cracked sidewalks and chain-link fences were the norm. When they arrived at Coleman Manor, Jamal's discomfort only grew. The house was enormous, an old-world mansion with ivy climbing the stone walls. Harrison led him through grand halls lined with artwork that probably cost more than his entire house. Jamal felt out of place, a stark contrast to the wealth and privilege that surrounded him. They entered a lavish sitting room where Jonathan Coleman waited by the fireplace. The old man was pale but alive, his sharp eyes studying Jamal as soon as he walked in. There was no warmth in his gaze, only an appraising look, as if Jamal were a puzzle to be solved. "You saved my life," Coleman said, his voice gravelly. Jamal shifted uncomfortably. "I just did what anyone would have done, sir." Coleman snorted, his expression hardening. "Nonsense. Most people would have walked by, pretended not to see. But you didn't. You acted." Jamal didn't know what to say. Coleman's demeanor was cold, almost ungrateful. Despite the fact that Jamal had saved him, there was no sense of appreciation in the room. Instead, there was a sense of superiority, as if Coleman were weighing Jamal's worth in the moment. "I owe you," Coleman continued, his tone curt. "And I'm not a man who leaves debts unpaid." Before Jamal could respond, Coleman leaned forward slightly. "I have a proposition for you. An internship at my company, Coleman Enterprises. It's a rare offer. I don't make it lightly." Jamal's mind reeled. Coleman Enterprises was one of the most powerful corporations in the country. An internship there could open doors he had only dreamed of. But there was something about the way Coleman spoke, something that made Jamal hesitate. It wasn't just the offer, it was the way Coleman saw him. Like he was doing Jamal a favor, like Jamal should be grateful for the scraps he was being thrown. I don't know what to say," Jamal stammered. "Say yes," Coleman said simply, his expression unreadable. Jamal hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on him. The opportunity was huge, but so was the feeling of being out of place, of being treated like a charity case. Yet despite the tension, the offer was too good to pass up. Finally, he nodded. "Yes," Jamal said, though deep down he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would change everything for better or for worse. Jamal sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the phone screen. The message from Mr. Harrison, Jonathan Coleman's lawyer, blinked in his inbox. "Mr. Coleman would like to formally offer you an internship at Coleman Enterprises." His fingers hovered over the screen, unsure whether to respond. He knew this was a life-changing opportunity, a stepping stone to a future he had only dreamed of. Yet, something gnawed at him, a feeling he couldn't shake. The night he saved Coleman played in his mind like a movie on repeat. The rich white man collapsing on the sidewalk, the looks from onlookers who hesitated as Jamal, a young black teenager, took charge. He wasn't seen as a hero. He was seen as out of place. Now this offer felt loaded. Jamal wondered if Coleman really saw potential in him, or if this was just a way to look good in the media, a successful businessman offering a young, disadvantaged black man a chance. Was he just a photo op to Mr. Coleman? A story to be told at lavish dinner parties? The weight of the decision pressed down on his chest, making it hard to breathe. He dialed the number. Hello, the voice on the other end was sharp, impatient. Harrison, the lawyer. Hi, this is Jamal Carter. I wanted to talk about the internship offer. Yes, Mr. Carter, I'm glad you called. Mr. Coleman is offering you a rare opportunity. You'd be a fool not to take it. The way he said fool made Jamal wince. There it was again, that simmering undercurrent of condescension. He wasn't being offered this because of his qualifications. He was being offered it because of what he represented. I'm grateful for the offer, but I'm not sure. Look, kid. Harrison cut him off. This isn't about whether you're sure. This is about your future. You come from a background where these kinds of opportunities don't exactly fall into your lap. Don't waste it. Mr. Coleman has connections, and trust me, he doesn't hand out favors often. You should be thanking him." Jamal clenched his jaw. Thanking him? For what? For throwing him a bone out of pity? He exhaled slowly, trying to steady his thoughts. "Okay," he finally said, his voice tight. "I'll take it." "Good. You start Monday." Jamal hung up, his stomach in knots. The opportunity was enormous, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was stepping into a world that didn't want him. The towering glass building loomed over Jamal as he walked through the city's bustling streets on his first day at Coleman Enterprises. The structure was a symbol of power, wealth, and influence, a world far removed from the cracked sidewalks and graffiti-stained walls of his neighborhood. He straightened his tie, wiping his sweaty palms on his pants before stepping into the marble-floored lobby. "Welcome, Mr. Carter," said a receptionist with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her tone was practiced, professional, but distant, like she'd said the same thing 100 times before to people who mattered more than him. Jamal gave a small nod and followed the directions to the elevators. As he ascended to the top floors, he glanced around, noticing the well-dressed professionals who barely glanced in his direction. Most were white, middle-aged, and confident, completely at ease in this environment. When the elevator doors opened, he was greeted by a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a cold smile. "Mr. Harrison." "Right on time," Harrison said, leading him down a maze of corridors. "You'll be working with the senior executives. You'll mostly be shadowing, taking notes, running some errands, learning the ropes." Jamal's heart sank at the word errands. Wasn't this supposed to be an internship? A chance to gain real experience? They arrived at a sleek conference room where several senior executives were gathered. Jamal could feel the weight of their gazes as he walked in. They weren't unkind, but they weren't welcoming either. He was an outsider in every sense of the word. "Ah, here's our new intern," one of the men, Mr. Duncan, said. His voice was friendly, but there was a hint of amusement, as if Jamal were some kind of curiosity. "You'll fit in just fine here, Carter." Jamal forced a smile, shaking hands and introducing himself, but he could feel it, the subtle, unspoken divide between him and them. They gave him menial tasks, and while they were polite, they barely acknowledged his presence beyond the necessary interactions. He was a ghost, seen but not truly seen. Over the next few weeks, Jamal worked hard to prove himself. He took notes during meetings, handled the small tasks they threw his way, and absorbed everything he could about the business. He tried to be optimistic, telling himself that this was just the beginning and that soon they'd see his potential. But the reality was different. The racial dynamics became more apparent as time went on. Jamal noticed that the few other Black and Latino employees at the company were often relegated to lower positions: administrative work, janitorial staff, the occasional assistant. And when he overheard conversations in the break room, he realized that promotions were rarely, if ever, given to people who looked like him. One day, after finishing a particularly tedious task, Jamal caught the tail end of a conversation between two executives. "I mean, it's good PR to have him around, right? Diversity and all that," one of them said, laughing under his breath. Jamal froze, his heart pounding. They were talking about him. "It doesn't hurt. Coleman's a smart man. Knows how to keep the media happy." Jamal clenched his fists, a wave of anger and humiliation washing over him. He wasn't here because they saw potential in him. He was here because he fit a narrative: a young Black man from a poor neighborhood, rising through the ranks thanks to the benevolence of Jonathan Coleman. It was all a game to them, a way to check off a diversity box without actually changing anything. Later that week, Jamal was assigned to assist with a major project. It was his chance to show what he was capable of. But when he arrived at the meeting, he was handed a pile of folders to distribute, while the white interns were seated at the table, ready to contribute ideas. "Just hand those out and sit over there, Carter," Mr. Duncan said, gesturing toward a chair in the corner. Jamal's blood boiled. He had been working just as hard, if not harder, than everyone else, yet he was being sidelined, reduced to nothing more than a glorified assistant. His hands trembled as he passed out the documents, his jaw clenched tight. During the meeting, he couldn't help but notice how the executives praised the white interns for their ideas, even when they were flawed or underdeveloped. When one of the minority employees offered a suggestion, it was dismissed without a second thought. The message was clear: if you weren't part of their inner circle, if you didn't look like them, your voice didn't matter. As the weeks passed, Jamal became more disillusioned. He had come here with high hopes, but the reality was a bitter pill to swallow. The racial tension was palpable, even if no one spoke about it outright. The microaggressions, the subtle slights, the dismissive looks, the way his opinions were ignored cut deeper than any overt insult. Jamal started to question everything. Was this the price of success? Was this what he had to endure to make it in this world? To be surrounded by people who didn't see him as an equal, but as a token, a symbol, something to be used to their advantage. He had been raised to believe that hard work and determination could take him anywhere. But here, in the cold, sterile halls of Coleman Enterprises, it felt like those values didn't matter. Not when the color of your skin determined how high you could climb. One evening, as he sat in the break room, staring at his reflection in the polished glass window, Jamal realized that he was at a crossroads. He could continue down this path, swallowing his pride and ignoring the racism that simmered beneath the surface. Or he could walk away with his integrity intact. The decision wasn't easy. He had worked so hard to get here. But deep down, he knew what he had to do. The next day, Jamal walked into the office, head held high, determined to make a change not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been marginalized, overlooked, or silenced because of the color of their skin. He was done being a pawn in someone else's game. It was time to take control of his own destiny. The air in the office was thick with tension, the fluorescent lights flickering faintly overhead. Jamal sat at his desk, glancing nervously around the pristine, modern office of Coleman Enterprises. He had been here for weeks, learning the ropes, shadowing executives, and trying to fit in. But despite the outward glamour of the corporate world, something felt wrong. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that beneath the glass walls and polished surfaces lay something much darker. One evening, after the senior executives had left for the day, Jamal found himself alone in the office, trying to finish some paperwork for a project. His eyes wandered toward Jonathan Coleman's office, a place he had only entered a few times but always left with a feeling of unease. The door was slightly ajar. His curiosity got the better of him, and he stood, walking quietly toward the office, his footsteps muffled by the plush carpet. Inside, Coleman's desk was as immaculately arranged as ever, but something caught Jamal's eye. A file half hidden under a pile of loose papers. The bold title on the folder stood out: Hollow Creek Project. Jamal's heart skipped a beat. He had heard whispers about Hollow Creek, an impoverished rural community predominantly made up of Black and Latino families. It had been struggling for years, but there had also been talk of revitalization efforts. He glanced over his shoulder to make sure no one was watching. Slowly, he opened the folder. The first few pages were technical land contracts, zoning permits, and environmental assessments, but the further he dug, the darker the story became. Hollow Creek hadn't been revitalized. It had been gutted. Coleman Enterprises had bought up massive swaths of land under the pretense of building infrastructure and creating jobs. Instead, they had extracted resources, displaced families, and left the community in ruins. The land was stripped bare, and the promises made to the community were never fulfilled. Jamal's hands trembled as he sifted through the evidence letters from families who had lost their homes, desperate pleas for help, and documentation of how the company had used its influence to push local leaders into accepting deals that left them powerless. The deeper he dug, the worse it got. The company had orchestrated a systematic destruction of the Hollow Creek community, all for profit. A letter caught his eye, a handwritten plea from a woman named Maria Ortiz, whose family had lived in Hollow Creek for generations. Her words were filled with heartbreak. "We trusted them. They said they would bring hope, but they only brought ruin. My children don't know where we'll live tomorrow. We've lost everything." Jamal's stomach churned. His suspicions about the company's unethical practices were confirmed, But this went far beyond what he had imagined. It wasn't just bad business. It was exploitation, racially targeted and systematic. Coleman had built his empire on the backs of people who couldn't fight back. His breath came in shallow gasps as the weight of what he had uncovered settled over him. For weeks, he had admired the power and success of Coleman Enterprises, hoping that one day he could rise to the top. But now, that success looked like poison tainted by the suffering of people like Maria Ortiz and her family. Jamal closed the folder, his mind racing. He couldn't stay silent. But confronting a man as powerful as Jonathan Coleman wouldn't be easy. He had to prepare for what was coming. The next morning, Jamal could hardly focus on his tasks. Every email, every phone call, every casual conversation in the office felt like a farce. His mind kept returning to the Hollow Creek project, to the faces of the families whose lives had been destroyed, and to the decision that lay ahead of him. He had to confront Coleman, but the thought of it terrified him. What could a young intern really do against a man as powerful as Jonathan Coleman? By the afternoon, Jamal's nerves were frayed. His palms were sweaty as he walked toward Coleman's office, each step feeling heavier than the last. When he reached the door, he paused for a moment, taking a deep breath to steady himself. Then, with a surge of determination, he knocked. "Come in," came the deep, cold voice from within. Jamal pushed open the door and stepped inside. Coleman sat behind his massive oak desk, a glass of whiskey in hand, his sharp eyes locked on Jamal as soon as he entered. The room was dimly lit, the only sound the soft crackle of the fire in the corner. "You've been doing good work," Jamal Coleman said, his voice as smooth and detached as ever. "I see a lot of potential in you." Jamal swallowed hard. His throat felt dry, but he forced himself to speak. "Mr. Coleman, there's something I need to talk to you about." Coleman raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "Oh, what is it?" Jamal hesitated, but then the image of Maria Ortiz's letter flashed in his mind, and he found his resolve. "I saw the files on the Hollow Creek project." For the first time since Jamal had known him, Coleman's expression changed. His eyes narrowed slightly, and his grip on the glass tightened. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. And Coleman's voice was lower now, more dangerous. Jamal's voice shook, but he pressed on. "How could you do that? You promised to help those people, and instead you destroyed their lives. They've lost everything." Coleman leaned back in his chair, his face hardening. "That's the cost of doing business, Jamal. You think you can succeed in this world without making sacrifices, without making tough decisions." Jamal shook his head, his anger rising. But this wasn't just a tough decision. It was wrong. Those were real people, real families. You exploited them for profit, and now they have nothing. Coleman's eyes locked onto Jamal's, cold and unyielding. "Let me give you a piece of advice, Jamal. If you want to make it in this world, you have to be willing to get your hands dirty. No one gets to the top by playing nice." Jamal's chest tightened as the words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had wanted to believe that success could be achieved without losing your soul, but Coleman was telling him otherwise. The man he had once admired for his power and confidence was now revealed as someone who had no moral compass, no empathy for the people he hurt. "Is that what you think?" Jamal's voice was quiet but steady. "That you have to destroy people to succeed?" Coleman's gaze didn't waver. "It's not about destroying people, Jamal. It's about surviving. In business, only the strong make it. If you're too weak to accept that, maybe you're not cut out for this." The room felt suffocating, the weight of Coleman's words pressing down on Jamal's chest. This was a man who believed that morality had no place in the world of business, that profit justified any means. But Jamal couldn't accept that. Not after what he had seen. "You're wrong," Jamal said, his voice gaining strength. "Success doesn't have to come at the cost of destroying people's lives. And if that's the kind of world you want to be part of, then I don't want any part of it." Coleman's expression remained icy, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, disdain, maybe, or the recognition that Jamal wasn't going to be easily swayed. "Think carefully," Jamal Coleman said, his voice low and dangerous. "You have a future here, a bright one. But if you're going to question every decision I make, then maybe you're not cut out for this. Jamal felt the weight of the choice pressing down on him. He had come so far, climbed so high, but at what cost? Could he really stay in a place like this? Knowing the harm it caused, could he live with himself if he became like Coleman? He took a deep breath and straightened his posture, meeting Coleman's gaze head on. I'm done. I can't be part of this anymore. For a moment, Coleman didn't react. Then, slowly, a small, cold smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. You'll regret this. Jamal turned and walked out of the office, his heart pounding but his conscience clear. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't going to become another cog in Jonathan Coleman's ruthless machine. Jamal stood at the window of Coleman Enterprises, his reflection blurred against the towering glass. The city hummed beneath him, an endless maze of power and wealth, everything he thought he wanted. But now that desire felt like a distant echo. His mind raced, replaying his confrontation with Jonathan Coleman over the Hollow Creek project. The image of those broken families haunted him. He could still hear the cold indifference in Coleman's voice, dismissing the devastation his company had caused. It's just business, Coleman had said, his expression unreadable, as if the lives of countless people meant nothing compared to another lucrative deal. For weeks, Jamal had pushed aside the gnawing sense of guilt, justifying it by telling himself he wasn't the one making the decisions. He was just an intern. But now he understood staying meant complicity. And complicity wasn't an option.
He gathered his courage and knocked on the door to Coleman's office. The opulence of the place only deepened the pit in his stomach. Coleman barely glanced up from his desk, a glass of whiskey in hand. His presence filled the room like a dark shadow, commanding yet detached.
Mr. Coleman, Jamal began, his voice steady but tinged with the weight of what he was about to say. I need to talk to you. Coleman's sharp eyes flicked up. Go on, he said, his tone indifferent. Jamal swallowed hard. I can't do this anymore. I can't be part of a company that destroys lives and profits off of people's suffering. For the first time, Coleman leaned back, his brow furrowing slightly. You're walking away from a future most people would kill for, he said, his voice low, almost dangerous. Do you really think you'll find success out there by playing the moral hero? This world doesn't reward integrity, Jamal. It rewards power. Jamal's heart pounded in his chest. He had come so far, seen a glimpse of a life he could only dream of, but that life came with a price he wasn't willing to pay. Maybe that's true for you, Jamal replied, his voice gaining strength. But I can't live like that. I won't. Coleman's eyes darkened. You'll regret this. Jamal didn't respond. He simply turned and walked out of the office, leaving behind the weight of Coleman's empire. The doors of Coleman Enterprises closed behind him with a finality that echoed in his soul. The internship, the promise of financial security, had all slipped away. But with every step, he felt lighter, like a heavy burden had been lifted from his shoulders. The bus ride back to his neighborhood was a stark contrast to the gleaming towers of Coleman Enterprises. Jamal stared out the window at the streets lined with small shops and worn-down buildings. This was home. A place where people fought to make ends meet, where systemic injustice weighed heavily on every corner. But he knew that this was where he needed to be. He wasn't going to be a part of something that tore communities apart. He was going to help rebuild them. The first step was reconnecting with the grassroots organizations he had always admired. He walked into the small community center, its walls covered with posters of protests, petitions, and local heroes. The room buzzed with energy activists, organizers, and volunteers, all working towards a common goal to uplift their people.
Jamal had met these people before, but now he was one of them. He had something to offer, a new set of skills he had learned at Coleman Enterprises. He approached a woman at the front desk. She looked up, recognizing him immediately.
Jamal Carter, she said with a smile. It's good to see you back.
Jamal smiled, feeling a warmth he hadn't felt in months. It's good to be back. I want to help however I can.
He quickly found himself working on campaigns against gentrification and corporate exploitation. The Hollow Creek files were burned into his mind as a stark example of how unchecked greed could ruin lives. But now, Jamal was determined to make sure it wouldn't happen again, not here, not in his community.
One evening, he stood in front of a group of local business owners and residents, presenting strategies on how to protect their homes and livelihoods from corporate developers. "We can fight back," he said, his voice strong and passionate. "We have the power to organize, to resist these companies that think they can walk all over us. They may have money, but we have people, and we have each other." The room erupted in applause, and Jamal felt a sense of purpose that far outweighed anything he had felt at Coleman Enterprises. He was no longer just a cog in a ruthless machine, he was part of a movement.
Months passed, and Jamal's life was far from easy. Without the steady income from Coleman Enterprises, he had to juggle school, community work, and part-time jobs just to stay afloat. But every day, as he walked the streets of his neighborhood, he knew he had made the right decision. He often thought back to Coleman's parting words, "You'll regret this." But Jamal didn't regret a thing. One afternoon, as he was working on a community development project, his phone buzzed. It was a news alert. Coleman Enterprises had just announced another major land acquisition, this time in a predominantly black neighborhood across the city. The headline read, "Coleman Enterprises set to revitalize urban communities." Jamal felt his stomach turn. He knew what that meant. Revitalize was just corporate speak for gentrification. It was the same pattern he had seen before: push out the people who had lived there for generations and replace them with luxury developments that only the wealthy could afford. But this time, Jamal wasn't powerless. He wasn't an intern at Coleman Enterprises anymore, bound by the corporate ladder. He was a leader in his community, and he knew how to fight back. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of organizing protests, gathering signatures for petitions, and meeting with local leaders. Jamal's name began to spread. He was becoming a symbol of resistance, a voice for those who had been silenced for too long. One day, after a long meeting with city officials, Jamal sat on the steps of the community center, exhausted but proud. A young boy, no older than 10, approached him, holding a flyer from one of the protests. "Are you Jamal Carter?" the boy asked, his eyes wide with admiration. Jamal nodded, smiling. "Yeah, that's me." "My mom says you're helping save our neighborhood," the boy said, his voice filled with hope. Jamal felt a lump in his throat. He had given up so much, but in moments like this, he knew he had gained something far more valuable. "Yeah," Jamal replied softly. "We're all working together, and we're going to win."
As the sun set behind the city skyline, Jamal stood up, looking out at the streets he had once thought he needed to escape. Now, he knew he didn't need to run. He needed to stay. This was his community, his people, and this was where he could make a real difference.
The road ahead would be long, and the fight for justice never easy. But Jamal had found something more important than wealth or status. He had found his integrity, and that, more than anything, would guide him into the future.